CO2 side. So oxygen's complexity is hemoglobin. CO2's complexity is bicarbonate. Most of the CO2 that is produced by the cells of the body is moved around not as CO2, but is moved around as bicarbonate instead. Okay, so we're going to talk about the three ways that CO2 moves around the body. Its production is always in one place, right? The cells produce CO2 as part of their metabolism. It diffuses into the capillaries. We saw that earlier today. Okay, so now where does the CO2 go? Some tiny amount of the CO2 stays dissolved in water, right? CO2 is highly soluble, so 7% of the CO2 that the body makes travels to the lungs as CO2. All right, now, most of the rest of the CO2, though, is going to diffuse across the membrane. Remember, no transporter required because it's a gas. Okay, so CO2 is going to go across the membrane, and we have a couple of two different things that can happen to it. One, some of the CO2 binds to hemoglobin and makes what's called carboxyhemoglobin. Now, the CO2 does not bind at the same site as oxygen binds. Okay, it's a different site entirely. But hemoglobin can hold on to CO2 all by itself. So that's about 23% of the CO2. So the remaining 70% is going to go down a path that is very familiar to you, right? So here's our CO2. We're going to add it to a water. We're going to make carbonic anhydrase, which breaks apart into bicarbon H+. Okay? So we've made a bicarb out of a CO2. This bicarbonate is shuttled back out of the membrane. There is a channel for that. And it's carried to the lungs in the plasma. Why? Because it has a negative charge, and we wouldn't want to fill our hemoglobin-filled red cells with bicarbonate. So it's shuttled back out. Okay? Now, when it's shuttled out, it's exchanged for chloride. Okay, so this CO2 came in, got made into bicarbonate, and got shifted out in exchange for chloride. Okay, so that's 70%. So 7% is dissolved CO2 in the plasma, 23% bound to hemoglobin, 70% as bicarbonate. Okay? Now, all of these are reversible reactions. Okay, so this is getting it into the blood. You know, I thought I had one on the reverse. So let's talk about the reverse. Now we're going to take this cell and move it to the lungs. Okay, all of these reactions reverse. Bicarbonate goes back in exchange for chloride going out. Bicarbonate joins with hydrogen ion, makes carbonic acid, which breaks down into CO2 or H2O and CO2. That CO2 comes out of the cell and then diffuses into the lungs where it's exhaled, right? So that's the 70%. The 23% attached to hemoglobin. In the lungs, as hemoglobin becomes more saturated, as it goes up to the flat part of the saturation curve, it pushes the CO2 off, right? So as hemoglobin saturates, CO2 is evicted. CO2 diffuses out into the lungs and gets breathed out, right? And then, of course, the CO2 that's just dissolved in water just reverses. Because the partial pressure of PCO2 in the alveoli is less than it is in the blood. So that it's going to pop out. It's going to come out of the blood automatically. So these three systems are how we move CO2 around. If you think about the overall metabolism, right, that for every molecule of oxygen we deliver, the cells are going to make a molecule of CO2, right? So molecule for molecule, this system is moving as many molecules of O2 as the hemoglobin system is moving. So it is a large scale system. It's just there's no transport protein because of our bicarbonate. Now this benefits us because the production of all this bicarbonate helps us, there's our buffer, right? So that's going to help us keep our pH at 7.4 because we have this constant production of CO2 as a carriage, or a bicarbonate as a carriage system. All right. So increases in PCO2 cause a right shift in the hemoglobin desaturation curve. That makes sense, right? If PCO2 is high, then we want oxygen to be delivered. If you flip this around, this is also why the equilibrium reverses in the lungs, right? Because in the lungs, we have very high oxygen concentrations, which means that the PCO2, or the CO2, tends to fall off, okay? So when blood is in a high oxygen environment, O2 is loaded in favor of CO2, okay? That's now the neuron just went in. Haldane, the Haldane effect is oxygen makes CO2 fall off. That's essentially what I'm saying. In other words, when PO2 is high, O2 is loaded in favor of CO2. So when the hemoglobin enters the lungs where the PO2 is high, the CO2 is dropped, right? When that same hemoglobin gets to the tissues where PO2 is low, CO2 is added. See? So the Haldane effect makes hemoglobin a reverse transporter for CO2. The same thing that's happening with oxygen happens in reverse with CO2 because of the Haldane effect. All right. So when blood is in the lungs, high PO2 favors release of CO2 from hemoglobin and release of hydrogen ion from hemoglobin. And both of those things then result in CO2 dumping. Forgot I didn't point this out. All right, so can I back up a little? CO2, right, diffuses in, adds to water, carbonic acid, bicarb, hydrogen ion. I did this part, right? Bicarb comes out, chloride goes in. Didn't talk about the hydrogen ion. Hemoglobin also is a buffer, like a good old-fashioned acid-base buffer. So when we get our hydrogen ion released from our bicarbonate production, that hydrogen ion attaches to the hemoglobin here, okay? Now, in the lungs, this reverses because of the Haldane effect, which causes this to fall apart, right? The Haldane effect reverses this process. The Haldane effect also reverses this process. So we get H pluses being released, we get bicarb that's in the plasma, and we get CO2 being released, all in the lungs. If you consider that we can take the bicarb and add it to the hydrogen, break it up and make CO2, that's another CO2 going out into the lungs. See, so all of the CO2 is going in, that's being carried here, is going to be back to its original state as CO2 in the lungs because of the high oxygen concentration there. Now that also means if you have poor oxygenation, your CO2 system starts to fall apart too, right? Because hemoglobin is responding to the high oxygen and dumping the CO2. If you have low oxygen, it's not going to dump the CO2 as well, right? So one of the death spirals in respiratory medicine is what we call a diffusion barrier, where the interstitium is so swollen or fibrosed that you can't get oxygen into the alveoli, because once that happens, then your CO2 elimination starts to fall off too because of these effects, the Haldane and Bohr effect.